range of performance practices, especially intercultural, post-colonial and black diaspora drama and theatre. He's a theatre academic, practitioner and writer. He's published in many international journals and is on the editorial boards of National Drama, African Performance Review, World Scenography, Africa and Middle East, and studies in applied arts and health. Dr. Victor has for many years followed the political, cultural and religious perspectives of events in the Middle East and their impacts worldwide. Next, Arthur. Arthur is an executive of Jews for Justice for Palestinians and organises their political lobbying and writes frequently on Israeli-Palestinian conflict in the serious papers and in internet-based media. And finally, Dr. Neureddine Miladi. Dr. Neureddine teaches media studies and sociology. He's the Islamic chaplain for the university, and his area of research interest is the Middle East. So a very knowledgeable panel here this evening, guys, and I hope you'll have lots of questions for them. If we can start with the first question of the evening from Reem Al-Tamimi.
Good evening, everybody. My question is, why isn't the international media allowed full coverage during the conflict between Israel and Gaza?
Thank you. Can I just repeat the question in case everybody didn't hear that? Why isn't the international media allowed full coverage in Israel and Gaza? So can we start with Arthur on this one, please?
Well, okay. Well, this, as almost everything else in the conflict, is highly contentious. My view, and I think the view of most of the journalists, if you can judge by their, if you like, by their attitude, is that Israel didn't want journalists there because they would have seen what was happening too much. And there were some journalists there. They just happened to be native Palestinians, and they took pictures with their mobile phones. Now that is my view.
Okay. Dr. Neureddine.
Yes, I mean, international media, including media in the Arab world, works within certain parameters and is regulated through certain the rules probably you and I know. The media in covering the Palestinian-Israeli conflict or the war on Gaza, it wasn't neutral, it wasn't, in my opinion, objective to a large extent. It was siding with a certain agenda. Now this time, the Israeli government, like the American government with the example of Iraq, it took the stance to not allow free journalism to operate in Gaza. Remember the invasion of Iraq in 2003, whereby Western journalists were asked to be embedded with the American army. I think in the same, basically, following the same trend, this is what we've seen during the invasion of Gaza. Some of the Western journalists, they were asked to be embedded with the Israeli army. Only some of the Arab and other Western journalists who used to happen to have existence before the invasion of Gaza or before the war on Gaza, who managed to relate to the world what exactly was happening. Think about, for example, some of the channels like Al Jazeera, Al Arabiya from the Arab countries, and think about some other Western journalists working for the BBC or others. Those are the people who managed, in my opinion, to give an impartial or a clear, truthful, to some extent, view of what was going on. Unfortunately, the BBC journalists and many other international journalists, they were not allowed access.
By whom?
Well, primarily by the Israeli government. That was very, very clear. I mean, the BBC announced, if you remember, you and I, every time we watch the 10 o'clock news or Newsnight, they say, well, actually, our journalists were not allowed or are not allowed to get into Gaza. That's why we don't have much reports or much footage. Only, by the way, the BBC Arabic journalists, they have an office in Gaza. they also have offices in Jerusalem, who are actually giving a very much different picture. If some of you have access to BBC Arabic, which started broadcasting about 8 months ago, certainly it gave a completely different picture of what was happening to the Palestinians in Gaza.
Dr. Victor, have you got a comment on this topic?
I think information is a very, very valuable commodity in the hands of governments. And whosoever controls the information controls what the public gets to know or gets to hear about a particular incident. And in this instance, I think it was the Israeli government that had control over what the world saw or listened to. And I think, I also believe that the concept of impartiality remains is utopia. Because whatever we say about the roles of journalists all over the world, journalists are human, they do have views. And sometimes governments like my colleague rightly pointed out, during the Iraqi invasion, the American government saw the power of the media. And in this particular instance, the Israeli government has stopped it from happening. It's a question of government managing, whatever they thought, was going to come out of that, of the presence of the journalists in that particular vicinity.
Can I ask if members of the audience have any points or questions that they'd like to make arising from the comments you've heard so far?
Is it possible that the reason they weren't allowed in was because they already knew about the possibility of the ratio of deaths between, as it was, 100 Palestinians to 1 Israeli? I mean, wouldn't that pictures and videos of that have totally destroyed their image in the international media, turned into a Vietnam, so to speak?
I think Michael Ellis wants to come in at this point.
Thanks, Chair. Can I invite people to look at it possibly from a slightly broader angle? We sometimes forget that Gaza actually has a border with Egypt as well as with Israel. And the Egyptian authorities also refused to allow media to go through into Gaza from their border. Also, again, continuing to look at it from a broad angle, not that it makes it right, but both the British and the Americans have sought to, shall we say, control the agenda when it comes to these types of developments themselves. We all know, of course, of the Americans' reluctance to allow the filming of the return of coffins draped in the American flag. NATO, when it was involved in the Bosnia conflict in the early 90s, actually bombed a television station, I think I'm right in saying, partly to control the message that was getting out. Israel, in its conflict with Hezbollah in Lebanon 2 years ago, in 2006, did allow full and unfettered media access. And in fact, there was live coverage there, interviews with commanders. They were even allowed to have microphones when commanders were having discussions. I think they found that it didn't work for them. It allowed their enemies to know what was happening. And I think that's the reason why they made the decision that they did. And I don't think it was the right decision, I might point out. I don't think it was the right decision, but I think that's the wider context and why they made it.
Would you like to chip in on this or not?
Very briefly. I think it's easy to criticize Israel for trying to stage manage the war. And I think if you listen to all the Israeli officials who were being interviewed by BBC or ITV, they all had very polished accents. You could not discern actually with Israeli from the type of English they spoke. The Israeli government wanted to win the hearts and minds of world public opinion. So they were trying to present the human face of the Israeli people through their government officials. But while you can criticize the Israeli government, obviously for trying to stage manage the process, one has to recognize that there's a very deep-seated sympathy within the West for Israel. Largely, I think it's the fallout of 9/11. I think 9/11/2001 has really changed the political landscape. So all Israel had to do was to label Hamas as a terrorist organization and engaging in terrorist attacks, and people kind of shut down They don't really want too much information because too much information actually confuses them. So I think while you could criticize the Israeli government, I think there's a wider context. I think one has to be appreciative of.
I think it's also, if I may, Chair, I think it's also important to bear in mind that it was only last year when a BBC journalist, Alan Johnson, who was actually their Gaza correspondent, was kidnapped by Hamas in Gaza and kept at gunpoint in some quite appalling conditions for several months, I think I'm right in saying, at least 3 or 4 months. And I think we have to bear in mind that it's not just Israel that considers Hamas a terrorist organisation. It is a widely recognised, both in Europe and in the United States and elsewhere, as a terrorist organisation.
Dr. Neureddine wants to come back on that.
Just to clarify, Alan Johnson, when he was kidnapped, he wasn't kidnapped by Hamas. He was actually released by Hamas, and this is a very big credit to the Hamas people who released him. And the unfortunate fact is that the very journalist of the BBC who was released by Hamas, the very corporation that had its journalists protected by Hamas people last year, and released by them or guaranteed his release, actually didn't do fair to or justice to the cause of the Palestinian people. I think there is a deep seated bias, in my opinion, with regard to the BBC impartiality when it comes to the Palestinian question. And I think there is a big question, in my opinion, with regard to how the BBC itself, as a public service broadcaster, portrays the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. It's always in line with the British foreign policy, which is very supportive to Israel and the state, less supportive to the Palestinians. I think the focus on the issue of terrorism, the issue of those who I call freedom fighters, are recognized or are seen by the BBC as terrorists. And unfortunately, this is the very view of the Israeli government. So that's probably one point to basically keep in mind.
I think the issue of terrorism and freedom fighters is a very difficult one. If you look back in history, you have the IRA, and members of the IRA would regard themselves as freedom fighters. If you look at Spain, ETA would say they were freedom fighters. Now, we're not discussing those particular conflicts here this evening, but what you've just said is very provocative. Arthur wants to chip in here, and then if members of the audience want to chip in with comments, very happy
to talk about the role of Hamas, and if you like, Hezbollah. My organisation, JFJP, and me, we do not support terrorism at all. I mean, we abhor terrorism. And that means to attack civilians for political ends. It is not moral, and it's certainly prohibited by the Fourth Geneva Convention. But in any conflict, in any real life, there's always a but. And by God, it's a big but. In almost any independence movement, some of the movement will resort to terrorism. As I say, it's not moral, but they do it. And the reason they do it is because of the tremendous asymmetry of power between the occupier and the independence movement. That's true of Hamas. Hamas are no angels. Fatah are no angels either. I mean, they're also politicians. And if you go back far enough in history, they had terrorism. If you go back a little further in history, Zionists had terrorism in the pre-state days. In fact, the leaders of the two Zionist terror groups later became the first two Likud prime ministers of Israel. And they didn't spend a single day in Israeli jail in between times. So going back to Hamas now, much more specifically, it's true that the United States, and certainly Israel, calls them a terrorist organization. I mean, that is in Israel's interest, so to do. But I think many, many people, including the Parliamentary Foreign Affairs Committee, has said they are more than that. And they should, and the West and Israel should have dialogue with them, because they're an independence movement which uses terrorism. And they can evolve. And terrorist groups have evolved.
I think, with respect, I think what one has to bear in mind is that this is an organisation, let's step away for a moment whether one says it's a terrorist organisation or not. In fact, the vast majority of people say that it is. But let's step away from that. This is an organisation which advocates the destruction of the State of Israel. So when one says it's important for them to talk with each other, you must understand in the context that you're asking for conversations to take place between someone who wants to destroy you And that it puts it in a very special context and makes it really rather difficult, because there is no latitude as far as the Hamas is concerned in dealing with Israel. They want the destruction of the state of Israel. And I think it's important to bear in mind the context of this. You talk about the asymmetry of power, but Israel is a country the size of Wales, surrounded by other countries, many of whom have displayed abject hostility to it since its independence, since its formation in 1947. So whether you agree with that or not, that is actually a fact. And therefore, in the context of the size of their country, they have to do what all government's prime job is to do, and that's protect its citizens.
Okay, I saw a hand up at the back. Carry on. So, yeah.
Yeah, I think here we are not here to legitimize what Hamas is all about. The act of violence and injustice that have been committed in Gaza. In the wide picture is 1.5 million Gazans are living in Gaza. And the Hamas are quite a few number compared to the population. And despite the whole population has been crying throughout the 3 days of bombing, Israel, and with the instruction of Israel, Egypt tried to close the borders. The problem is, why did they close the borders? If they forget about the issue of journalism, why did they close the borders in humanitarian and not let the people go the way they're doing in Lebanon?
Yes, go on. Yep.
I think one of the reasons why I think the Israeli government closed the borders, the Israeli government made it very plain from the outset that they were going to use disproportionate force to respond to what was going on. And because they were going to use disproportionate force, it meant that they didn't want the world to see everything that was happening. And because they were targeting Hamas as a movement, they said they wanted to destroy Hamas and neutralize it. If you open the borders, then Hamas will escape into Egypt or elsewhere, only to rearm and engage the same conflict, which is precisely one of the two reasons they gave for going after Hamas in the first place.
I understand the borders were also closed, partly because that was the route by which arms were coming in. Okay, gentleman in the front.
I was just going to say about Hamas's commitment to the destruction of the state of Israel. They did fall under that charter, but just like to compare them to the IRA, provisional IRA formed under a charter of removing the United Kingdom from Ireland and making the whole of it a republic, but eventually reconciled to the state that they're in now. If you want to deal with Hamas, shouldn't that be the way to go, rather than just to constantly state what they originally set out to do?
Yeah. I think that's a very good note to end on. So thank you for that. Moving on to question 2 of the evening, can I call Patricia Jacques?
I just want to know if it's fair for the international community to place such a burden on the Obama administration by expecting him to save the world.
Thank you. I think everyone heard that. So, can we start with Ron, please?
Well, I don't know if it's a question of being fair, but I think it's probably appropriate to expect Obama to restore the credibility of the United States in the international arena. He placed a great deal of his campaign on pledging basically to for the United States to assume the high moral ground in international affairs, which he felt was dissipated through the 8 years of the Bush administrations. And he even campaigned in Europe during the election. He came to Berlin just as John F. Kennedy did when John F. Kennedy was president. So I don't think it's a question of being fair. The burden, I think, is obviously in the Obama presidency. The expectations that he's aroused are going to be very difficult to fulfill. And I think if you watch very closely during his inaugural address, he was trying to assume a more presidential style and trying to lower people's expectations in terms of what could be accomplished and how long it will take to accomplish those objectives. But yet he still has 63% approval rating, despite the fact that he's had some difficulty in getting his economic stimulus package through the Congress. So I think Obama, is off to a relatively good start, and I'm hopeful that he will restore the credibility of the United States.
Going back to the question, I think it's unfair, and there are two reasons why I think it's unfair for the international community to expect so much on Obama. American foreign policy has always been about America. And I think it was Kissinger who said it, that in American, in international politics, you have permanent self-interest, but never permanent friends. So Obama, whatever Obama is doing for America and the world today is to serve America's interest in the long run. Now, so for that reason, I also think that because Obama is the first African Americans to get into that office, to expect to place such a burden upon him is in a way unjustified, in the sense that if he fails, the knock-on effect will affect every black American and black people in other societies. Obama is the president of America. He's not the president of the world. He cannot be. And I think that his responsibility to serve America so that the whole world doesn't get disappointed too early, and then putting the progress that black Americans have made in America backward.
Very briefly, I suppose it might be a little unfair, but it could be not solve all the world's problems, but it could help to solve many of them and make them less bad, because, of course, every country looks after its own interests. But Obama and the people around him are children of the Enlightenment. So they know that America's long-term interests are not served by being daggers drawn with the rest of the world all the time, but only by cooperation. And that means they accept, if he goes on, as one hopes he does, they accept they cannot get every single thing they want down to the last degree. They have to give a little. George Bush, on the other hand, was a child of the Middle Ages, and he didn't accept that. So I think there might be a very big difference. And one of the clues is the fact that he appointed Mitchell as his Middle East envoy. Now, Mitchell knows something or two from his previous stint there. He has a record of being actually able to bring the parties together, which he did in Northern Ireland. He's a realist. Obama also said, when he announced the appointment of Mitchell, he'll report on his mission to me, not to Clinton, to me, not me, Obama. And that's a good side. So, you know, the jury's out, but keep your fingers crossed.
Want to chip in? Could you just wait a second? Anyone in the audience? Yep.
Well, what I was going to say is, with regards to the international community and its response to Gaza, is how stark the double standards are. For example, Israel intervened in Gaza with the premise of they were protecting their citizens. Did Russia not do that with South Ossetia back last year? And instead, the international community has stayed largely quiet with its criticism of Israel, whereas Russia is being vilified for their actions in
Okay, sorry, if I just one sentence. When we talk about international community, I hope we are not talking about America and Britain, because I didn't see any countries in Africa jumping on the bandwagon to support the Georgians against Russia. It was mainly the Western press, it was mainly Britain and America.
Yeah. Neureddine, you wanted to come in?
That's what is normally referred to as the international community. I dare to say that it's unfortunate for Barack Obama to be elected at this time of a very drastic economic downturn, because I think he'll be an excellent president for his country, representing the black community in the world, representing the powerless in the world, who are trying to have a say in the international politics and international relations. What's going to happen to him, and what's being seen by everybody nowadays, is he's going to be very much focused in sorting the economic problems of a country that has been simmering for a long time without the whole world being aware of the economic catastrophe. So this is what Barack Obama is going to be very, very busy doing. Instead, you and I are expecting from this president to try and solve or rectify the legacy of a president who left the image of the US wrecked in the world, including the Arab countries. I mean, any surveys done during the last few years will tell you how much the Arab people, they don't hate Americans, but they hate the American administration. Look at the image in the Arab press, in the Arab media, of George W. Bush, the example of the shoe affair in Iraq. I think this talks volumes, in my opinion. So it was, in my opinion, to start with, it's unfortunate, but this is how the world works. I hope that Barack Obama will be able, with his team, to probably sort out some of the issues still rampant in Iraq, in Afghanistan, in Palestine, and elsewhere in the world, including Sudan and parts of Africa. And it's very, very challenging. But his whole era, in my opinion, during the next couple of years, is going to be colored by the economic downturn around the world.
I actually think that rather than see Barack Obama interfere in the affairs of other countries, we'd rather him interfered less. Because if George Bush had interfered less, we'd have a lot fewer problems than we have.
Sort out the mess. Sort out the mess.
Well,
yes. Anyway,
sorry, could I just say about that? I mean, Chair, you say interfered less, but of course, many would argue that at least his rationale for Iraq and certainly for Afghanistan was the fact that America had been attacked on 9/11, and 3,000 people had been killed in the Twin Towers and at the Pentagon. And it's important also to recall that that predates even George W. Bush, because it's since been established that the plans to attack the United States on September the 11th date back to the Clinton administration. So I think one can see, if you like, too many smoke and mirrors here. And George Bush did no favours to the Americans in the international community. That's certainly right. But what he was doing, many would argue, was responding to an attack on his home country. And it's the job of any leader of any country, and I challenge anyone to find another country anywhere in the world who would elect a leader whose first priority would not be to protect its own interests. That's the job of the leader that they're electing.
But the problem is that he has not protected their interests, and America is more vulnerable now than it was before he did what he did. Every American citizen is more likely to be hurt than before. Anyway, Ron wanted to come back on the Obama issue.
Yeah, I want to come back on the Obama issue because I think one would expect possibly more continuity in American foreign policy than change. I think the change is more likely to be in style, in presentation. I mean, Obama quite rightly said the United States was fighting the wrong war in Iraq. His whole candidacy was brought into public view by his very principled stand against U.S. intervention in Iraq. He's from the very beginning he's opposed to war in Iraq, and very rightly, I might add. But he's named Robert Gates as Secretary of Defense, a carryover from the Bush administration. He's already said that he's going to redirect forces from Iraq to Afghanistan. That's where he thinks the war should be fought. But at the same time, one has to hope that some degree of realism will set in the Obama administration. Afghanistan is a quagmire. Every foreign occupier going back to the 19th century has found that out, has never been able to defeat the Afghanistan people, and one would hope that, again, we'll have some realism in the White House in some negotiations with the Taliban. I think that's the only way forward, basically, to promote the national security of the United States. And I have to agree with the chair of the panel that basically the Bush administration has left the American people less secure.
Anyone from the audience want to chip in anything? Chap at the back?
Yeah, isn't it the thing about Obama? It's not so much how little he can do, but how much he will do. Because the thing about an American president, of course, American presidents are hamstrung when it comes to domestic policy. And when they're hamstrung in domestic policy, they tend to
look overseas, because that's where an American president has power. You know, that's what Clinton did, and we'll see perhaps how much Obama will do. Now that's the thing we need to be looking at. You know, is he going to be prepared to get himself involved in Palestine, Israel? We'll just have to wait and see, I guess.
Well, if I may, Chair, I mean, absolutely correct. Many American presidents have turned to foreign affairs because they feel they can get more done. Clinton did with the whole peace process in Northern Ireland, of course, with some success there. However, Barack Obama is in a slightly better position than those former American presidents because he has a lot of support in the Senate and in the House of Representatives. It's been such an overwhelming victory for him that both of their houses of legislature are actually predominantly Democrat, and so he ought to have more support from Congress than previous presidents who've had to work with their opposite numbers in their houses. But I think the achievement here is not just Barack's achievement. The achievement actually is that of the American people, because what they have done is elected a new human being, different, a child of enlightenment, as my friend has called it. And that is an achievement of the Americans, the American people. Again, try and think of another country which has been so successful in assimilating. I realise there are problems. Of course there are problems within the American society, as there are in every society. But they have successfully assimilated. And as Barack Obama recently said on Al Jazeera television, you know, he's a black man with Muslim relatives, many of them living in Africa, in Kenya still, and he's been elected President of the United States. And that gives the lie to a lot of people in the world who are illogical, without rationale, anti-American just for the sake of being anti-American. At least that's giving the lie to that and showing people that they can and have elected Barack Obama as President. I wish him all the very best.
I'd echo what Michael said, but the thing that I am quite terrified of is some lunatic redneck taking a rifle and attacking him. And that's serious, no, really serious.
Mind you, he must be so well guarded. I mean, he must have several layers of secret service around him.
Yeah, but
it's very dangerous.
Still. Yes?
I think I'll choose to be optimistic that Obama will survive the presidency. And I do this because the Americans were optimistic enough, you know, to rise over and above prejudice of all kinds, to elect a different kind of human beings. And I have a feeling that there's a groundswell of support in America, and right throughout the world, to give a chance to this person that has been elected to see what change, what new direction will the world go into. And I think that goodwill will ride for a long time. And hopefully the anger of the rednecks will by then have the
most of them anyway.
Just to bring back on how guarded he is, he's actually so guarded, he's in a bubble here. And that might be his downfall, because I mean, the case of when Binyam Mohammed sent him a letter from Guantanamo Bay, it was actually screened and edited by the US military to not allow the commander-in-chief to read. I mean, how guarded, I mean, is he going to be able to do his job if somebody on his land cannot even give him a letter without the US military screening it? I mean, what commander-in-chief have you ever heard of not being able to read the material ever?
That's an interesting point. Thank you for that. Oh, sorry.
Sorry,
yes.
I just wanted to ask the panel what they think the media has a role to play in ensuring that Barack Obama's administration as president is a successful one.
Yes, yes, go on.
I think one of the things the media can do is to, as somebody has said over here, leave him alone and not raise too much of our expectations in terms of what he will do. Because the danger in raising somebody to such a high pedestal, especially with this huge weight of expectation, is the fact that everything that he does wrong will stick out like a sore thumb. And when the media picks on that, before you know it, we've whittled down every support we'll have. So the media must give him the chance to make his mistakes as a human being, as a politician. All politicians make mistakes. We all make mistakes. Allow him. He's not an angel. We must see him that he's a man like any of us who sneaks into the toilet to smoke, and if the world, the media give him that opportunity, then he'll make his mistakes and learn from them, and then hopefully be a better president.
Okay, there's a question in the audience.
I have to just quickly reply to that. So, whilst I agree with the sentiment, why should Obama be allowed make mistakes as politicians. We certainly don't allow our government or politicians, especially the current government, to make any mistakes whatsoever or do anything right.
I agree. The world is worse for it. I think the world is worse for it by not giving politicians a chance to make a mistake. I mean, the kind of things Gordon Brown is doing
I
true.
said I agree with the sentiment.
Yes.
Just be realistic.
Chair, if I may say, I actually agree with both Victor's points and the contributor from the floor, because what Victor's saying about the media, the relentless criticism by the media, and in the UK as well, it's totally unrealistic. It not only does it put people off politics, puts people off going into politics because they know they're not perfect. They might have smoked something they oughtn't to have done when they were 15 years of age, or been in detention or something, and it gets dragged up, and it has been dragged up. And on the other hand, of course, why should the press give Barack Obama an easier time than anyone else? In fact, I think it's a part of the modern democracy. The media are an important check and balance on the power of our leaders, and therefore they should keep a close eye on them.
Question from the floor.
Yeah, I just wanted to raise a point which hasn't been brought up yet, about to do with the wealth of expectation that there is on President Obama's shoulders. He stood as a centrist Democrat candidate. He didn't stand as a black candidate, although he is black. He stood as a Democrat centrist candidate. Isn't there a danger that if there is any disappointment to be gleaned in future years, isn't there a danger that it will be black people that feel that a black president will do more for them, emancipate them more than other sections of society as a whole? Isn't that the main danger in terms of
Yes. I think there's a danger in that, but I think one of the things that a few people that support him after his election was his barber, had a press conference where he said that with Obama becoming the president, that instead of becoming lazy, and he's got to work 5 times as hard, because whatever Obama does reflects on him. And I think for the black people, it would be wrong for them to expect that this is one man who's going to solve the problems of the black race. And it's going to be a danger.
Yeah. I have a different view on that. I don't think that if Obama fails as president of the United States, it's going to be a setback for the black people of the United States. Because I think Obama ran as a post-racial candidate. He was very careful to distance himself from that civil rights era of politicians, Jesse Jackson, for example. He tried to move beyond the politics of victimhood, and I don't see that as happening. I think possibly African American people might see themselves possibly as failing through him, but I don't think it'll be a setback necessarily for racial politics in the United States.
I want to take one more question from the floor, and then move on. So
just to go back to what you said about allowing Obama to make mistakes, I think the only main and why should he be allowed to make mistakes? I think that the main difference between this election and any other one in history is that this Obama started off on a pedestal. Most politicians don't start that high, and the fall from grace will be a lot more damaging. I mean, the last time I saw something like this was in South Africa when Nelson Mandela became president. And Nelson Mandela had big shoes, which unfortunately
he lived up to the ideal, didn't he? Nelson did, yeah.
But no, it's a very good point. I mean, to be fair to Barack Obama, he did get some things wrong in the early days of his administration, and what I found admirable was the fact that he stood up and said, "I screwed up." How refreshing is that? When was the last time you heard Gordon Brown, Tony Blair, David Cameron say that?
Tony Blair did though, didn't he?
And then Spain
Okay. Go on very quickly.
I just want to comment on the question this young lady asked about why the politicians always get it in the neck if they make a mistake. My only comment is there are mistakes and mistakes. Some are okay, they're the mistake anybody can make in good faith, even if he's competent. Some are really biggies. And I think where Gordon Brown is now probably getting it in the neck, justifiably I think, is the mistake he made. But the American administration made it at the same time. They allowed deregulation of the financial industry and the banking industry to proceed to such an extent that it was beyond all the bounds of prudence, and we have a big problem now as a result. There might have been a recession to an extent anyway, because there are cycles in the economy, but by God, we have a biggie now. And I think Gordon Brown's and George Bush's attitude to regulation over nearly 10 years has an awful lot to do with that.
The one observation I'd make as a former corporate banker is 20/20 hindsight is so easy.
True enough.
Yeah.
But
moving on.
Well, I would just like to reflect that talking about mistakes and apologies, the apologies that were made to the Treasury Select Committee this week were actually, we're sorry, but it wasn't our fault.
Yeah, it wasn't
and that
really,
is appalling, and I actually think that it's really, incredible. We expect a much higher level of accountability from our political leaders, and I'm not saying that we shouldn't, but actually we need to expect that from the bankers, and I do find it slightly disconcerting that the Conservative candidate is saying, there should have been more regulation. I don't understand that.
I would reflect the Sun headline about that particular select committee, where they said, what a sorry bunch. Yeah. Anyway, moving on. We have a question from Alex.
Does the panel think that in the current world recession, that it will lead to more extreme forms of politics from both the left and right?
Right, Michael.
I think there is the danger of that. There are historical examples of that. And of course it's the responsibility of all mainstream politicians to do the best they can to prevent that. But I don't think it's necessarily a given that will happen. And there are those that will always look for excuses to move either to the extreme left or to the extreme right. This economic downturn is largely as a result of inability and unpreparedness to regulate the markets, which got well too far. But I don't see that it's essential that because of this downturn it will turn people to extremes of politics. I certainly think it should not, and everything should be done by all the mainstream parties to prevent it, because it is abhorrent.
Ronald?
Well, I would think, if you look at the example of Great Britain, which I wouldn't necessarily generalize from, but you have pervasive anti-immigrant feelings being expressed. Not necessarily by the BNP, which you would expect basically to voice those feelings, but by people who are unemployed and can't find work, and they think their prospects are made worse by the fact that there are immigrants from the EU who are coming into Great Britain. So there is fertile ground, possibly, for the BNP to exploit anti-immigrant feeling. But I would think that the political landscape, I think, probably will not be reshaped by the BNP, even though they might make some inroads in some local elections.
They have tiny support. Statistically, their support is absolutely tiny, and they've only been able to achieve one, I think, council seat in the north, and they are not a force to be reckoned with, and nor should they be, as a political entity. But it is likely that they will attempt to militate against the mainstream parties and attract unsavoury, by their unsavoury arguments, attract support that way. I don't think, I agree with what I think Stephen Phillips, the chairman of the Commission for Racial Equality, has said relatively recently, which is that he does not believe Britain to be a racist country, and that in fact there is far more pervasive problems along these lines in many of our European neighbours on the continent than there is in this country. I don't think the British people will tolerate it. I think the British people will not tolerate that sort of thing as a general rule.
But I don't think you can I don't think you just judge the BNP strength by the number of council seats they have. They have been running more and more candidates and contesting more and more elections, and they did, in the borough council elections, they ran a very strong campaign in Lovelytubs and Delapre, and the economic conditions are quite different then. So I would not be so complacent to see the BNP not being a threat.
I'm not complacent.
No, I think fair comment. Neureddine, did you want to comment on that? No?
Just a brief one to say that there will be extremist elements, whatever happens, and the economic climate makes such possible. But I think that there's a greater degree of widespread understanding of what governance is compared to 50 years ago, when majority of the population followed whatever was on the table for them. But this time, I think politicians today are held more, to account for the things for the actions they take. And I think for that reason, it will be impossible to see the kind of extremism at government level happening because of the situation. But outside of government, there will be pockets of extremism. I know that is going to happen. Yes.
Is there anyone in the audience that wants to make a comment on that? Yes?
I think there could be an association between extreme political agitation and economic downturn through unemployment and people finding something to do for themselves, and that can manifest in extreme politics.
Yeah. Somebody at the back? Yep.
I'm union representative, and with NUS nationally as a student body, we work quite well with them in terms of campaigns against the BNP and stuff. And they strongly believe that the next 18 months that BNP are going to have a strong strand in a lot of different areas. And I just wanted to know if the panel, in terms of educating the ordinary person, because we can educate the student, because students can do a lot of stuff. But what sort of policies would you kind of say that would educate the ordinary person in terms of the difference between different policies, between different sort of political organisations?
Victor, do you have a view on that one?
I think history would be our guide on that, because all extremist governments have started as popular governments. If we go back to 1939 in Germany, that's how it started. And if we allow history to teach us, not to allow history to repeat itself, then we could learn. I expect that young people will see that, despite the toxin that BNP represents, and the fact that what its brand of politics might appeal, such extremist views only appeal for a moment and become self-destructive. And I think that's the lesson that history has taught us, which we have to abide by, so we don't go down that line.
Quickly also, mainly in local elections, it's been also proven that the BNP has been gaining votes due to a protest vote with people disillusioned with the government and British politics as a whole.
Yes. You wanted to come in on this one?
I was just going to say the BNP, I only agree with Michael Ellis on something here. They're not a force to be reckoned with. A bunch of cowards. Half of them couldn't be bothered to actually become full members, and they were on that extremist list that came out in the public. I actually had a copy of it and I ran through, and the amount of police officers I saw, and it was disgusting. But they're not a force to be reckoned with. They're actually quite cowardly. I even lived on a road which BNP had the seat, so they were second most powerful party. And I lived there for a year, and the neighbours were great. There was nothing wrong with them whatsoever. And they even had great British flags in the window, and some people feel afraid to walk there, but I felt no fear whatsoever. I think they were scared of me, to be honest. So I tell you, fear not. The BNP, let them have their seats, but they will never have the power.
Cowardice.
Yes.
It's cowardice.
Yeah. I'll take a couple more on this one, then we've got another question. Lady at the back?
I don't think that we should be complacent with what the BNP is doing at the moment, because they do have a strong force. I don't know, have you seen what happened in France in the last election with Le Pen, obviously, this rise of hate towards foreigners and those people coming. And that's why it's important to educate our population, the students, the younger people, about equality and diversity.
Much as I disagree with the BNP's policies, do you think that non-extremist politicians could help by looking into the issues that drive those policies to be made in the first place and drive the opinions to be formed of the people who hold them? For example, people may hold an opinion about a particular issue which then is formed into an extremist viewpoint illogically. But perhaps if a normal politician were to address that issue a bit more in the first place, then it wouldn't become so become so extreme.
Yeah, interesting. Arthur, did you want to comment on that?
No, it's fine.
No, that's okay. There was somebody in the front, yeah.
During the recent Wildcat strikes at energy plants, the BBC showed that a lot of local, low-class, not low-class, low-income, that's it, workers were very concerned about Italian workers stealing their jobs and made some very unsavoury comments. But this was later shown to be edited and removed things that views which were not anti-Italian but more protect their own jobs. Is it not a worry that mainstream views could become more extreme rather than just the right and left wing just going further away?
Can I speak to that? I think that strike has been misrepresented by the tabloid press. I don't know about the broadsheet press. I take The Guardian. The Guardian, I think, had very good coverage of the strikes. Workers were quoted as saying that nothing against the Italian workers, they were good workers. What they were arguing against was the lack of access to vie for those jobs against foreign contractors. The issue was basically the deregulation of the labor market, which has been part of the neoliberal agenda pushed through the European Union for 10 years. And employers have been exploiting rules and regulations basically to possibly undermine terms and conditions of existing workers. So there might have been an undercurrent of nativism against foreign workers, but by and large, the union spokespersons for those strikes were very clear to distance themselves from anti-immigrant expressions.
Okay, thank you for that. I'd like to move on to another question now. Could Neil put his question, please?
Now that there's joint power in Zimbabwe, what does the panel think is going to move forward in the future in the area?
On that one, Neureddine?
Well, I can probably, although I'm not an expert in Africa, but I've been like many other people following what has been going on in Zimbabwe during the last few years, and certainly I was one of those hoping to that the country stands on its feet sometime before this time and sort out a kind of a democratic model which will please the existing Mugabe regime and also the opposition party. But I think what has happened during the what was it a couple of days ago, I think was very much a sign of hope for the future of the country. I mean, remember, this country has been kind of suffering from all kinds of economic downturns, all kinds of diseases and so forth. I'm one of those who hope that this framework will work, although Mugabe still remain himself as a person who is holding power. Remember, he still has got the army, and he's sharing the power of the police with the Prime Minister, so therefore he can do anything at any minute. I think the whole thing is going to go around the image of Mugabe at the end of the day. When he probably goes away sometime, then probably we'll see a real breakthrough in the Zimbabwean politics, in my opinion. This is the hope.
I agree with Neureddine about that, if I may, Chair, because what we have is a situation where Morgan Tsvangirai is not in control. He has been given some power, but it seems to me, as far as we can tell, that Robert Mugabe still has overriding power, and he's going to face, Tsvangirai is going to face an uphill struggle while Mugabe is still pulling the strings to control the situation. Mugabe has destroyed that country, which used to be called the breadbasket of Africa, and he has almost single-handedly and in the most appalling fashion destroyed that country.
I think that the approach that the Zimbabwe government has been taking now is try to shore up its diplomatic relations with its African neighbors, and that's what this power sharing deal probably will do, and possibly garner some Western aid, which is desperately needed to Zimbabwe. That's in the short term. And in the long term, one never knows if the situation fails to improve the condition of the Zimbabwean people. Will Mugabe then engineer a coup, basically in justifying
the removal of Tsvangirai?
Exactly, because he has failed to deliver. So, I mean,
It's hard to predict what's going to happen, right?
There's a question at the back, if I can take that one first.
Yeah, I was just going to say, does it not strike anyone, any of the panel, that the power sharing agreement that has been brought about and finally signed between the MDC and ZANU-PF and Robert Mugabe, surely does it not seem to them that they're basically going to use Tsvangirai as a scapegoat for the problems and just to strengthen their entire grip on power?
That's what Ron was saying. I think that's right. I think that's the danger, and I think many people in Tsvangirai's position would not have put himself in that position. Many people would have said, I'm not going to take the Prime Ministership whilst Mugabe is still... He's taken a risk, I think.
Lady there?
I just wanted to sort of express an appeal for the whole situation. As a Zimbabwean myself, I personally believe that the whole power sharing thing is basically a waste of time. So I feel like it's just a way for the president to cling on to power for a bit longer.
But the point is, the other solution for the country is to get into another civil war. Yes, I do agree with you, but the other side of the coin is the country to get into another civil war. To Mugan Tsvangirai and his party will be jailed again, harassed again, probably many of them killed. This is, I think it's very positive in my opinion, although it's not a fantastic solution for the opposition. But I think it's very positive for Mugan Tsvangirai to take this chance, to show the world that he is ready for peace, that he is willing to do business and so forth. That's probably a solution I would take if I was a politician in that country.
Arthur wants to jump in here.
Yeah, just to briefly say, it probably isn't just Mugabe. It's probably a lot of the army generals around him. And like him, I'm sure they all have their snouts in the trough. And it's possible, even, I don't know what he does, but even if he wanted to have a fair political system and let Tsvangirai take power, he might not be allowed to. So it's a very difficult situation. I don't think these things ever change quickly. And if they do change quickly as a result of violence, that can breed more violent change. So maybe slowly is the only sensible way.
Mr. President, do we have time for one more question?
Yeah, definitely.
Yep.
That's okay with the audience.
Paul has a question.
In light of Carol Thatcher's recent sacking for BBC's One Show, is it right that presenters such as Jonathan Ross can actually get away with what they say and only get a suspension? Is it double standards from the BBC to sack somebody but only suspend somebody else? And it's also the same for who was from BBC Radio 2, not 5. Russell Brandon as well. So he lost his job over the same thing, but Jonathan Ross has paid all his money.
Ron. Sorry, Victor.
I've got just one sentence to say. I think it's the ratings game, you know, as long as Jonathan Ross brings in the ratings, keep him on. Then the other people are expendable because the ratings were not, if you look at the records, were not as high as Jonathan Ross's economics ratings, nothing else.
Did you want to say something?
Well, I think Jonathan Ross apologized, showed the proper attitude towards acknowledging his mistake. Carol Thatcher did not. She did not admit that she did anything wrong, and that was her downfall. If she admitted she had done something wrong, I think she would still have a job.
Okay, well I think that's a good time to finish the proceedings. Can I thank everyone very much for coming. The Debating Society are hoping to make this an annual event. I hope you've all enjoyed it, and I hope you'd be interested in coming again in a year's time. Thank you to the Debating Society for arranging it, because I think it was fun, and thank you to the panel. So I can say thank you.